In the scorching Australian summer of 1932, a war unlike any other broke out on the dusty plains of Western Australia. It was not fought between rival nations, nor between armies of men armed with tanks and artillery. Instead, it was a conflict that pitted trained soldiers, fresh from the battlefields of the First World War, against an enemy that could neither fly nor fire back, the humble emu. This bizarre chapter of history would come to be known as the Great Emu War, and it remains one of the strangest military campaigns ever recorded. To understand how such an absurd clash could occur, we must rewind to the years after World War I. Thousands of Australian soldiers returned from the trenches of Europe to a homeland that was still recovering from economic downturn. As part of a government initiative, many of these veterans were given plots of land in Western Australia with the promise that they could rebuild their lives as farmers. It was meant to be a reward for their service, a way to turn warriors into men of the soil. But farming was not easy. The land was harsh, the climate unforgiving, and markets unstable. By the early 1930s, the Great Depression had made things worse, leaving farmers desperate and under pressure to produce crops, particularly wheat, which the government had promised to buy, though payment was often delayed. Into this tense situation marched an unexpected army, the emus. Standing nearly 6 feet tall and weighing over 40 kilograms, these large flightless birds were already native to the Australian landscape. Normally, they lived in the outback, but in 1932, something changed. Driven by seasonal migrations and the search for food and water, tens of thousands of emus descended upon the newly cultivated farmland in Western Australia. For the farmers, who had invested blood, sweat, and scarce resources into their crops, the sight of these giant birds tearing through wheat fields was devastating. Barbed wire fences proved no match for the emus, who trampled them with ease. The birds devoured crops, knocked down structures, and left destruction in their wake. To the farmers, this was nothing less than an invasion. Desperate for help, the farmers turned to the government. And the government, perhaps still thinking in terms of military solutions after the Great War, responded in a way that seems almost satirical today. They sent in the army. In November 1932, Major G.P. W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery was dispatched with soldiers armed with Lewis machine guns and thousands of rounds of ammunition. Their mission was simple in theory: eliminate the emus, protect the crops, and restore order to the farmlands. On paper, it sounded straightforward. In reality, it would prove to be a humiliating disaster. The first encounters between man and bird were almost comical. The soldiers, expecting large flocks that would be easy targets, set up their machine guns and prepared for victory. But the emus had no intention of standing still. They scattered into small groups, darting quickly across the landscape with surprising speed and agility. Their long legs carried them at nearly 50 kilometers per hour, and their erratic movements made them nearly impossible to hit. The Lewis guns, designed for trench warfare, were clumsy and ill-suited for chasing birds across rough terrain. In one infamous incident, the soldiers attempted an ambush at a watering hole where a flock of emus had gathered. The gun jammed after only a few rounds, and the birds simply scattered into the bush, unharmed. In another attempt, troops mounted a machine gun on the back of a truck, hoping to chase the emus down across the open plains. The plan failed miserably. The terrain was too uneven, the gun too unstable, and once again, the emus outran their pursuers. As days turned into weeks, it became clear that the soldiers were losing. Reports describe emus as if they were trained guerrilla fighters. They traveled in small, mobile groups, with a few birds seemingly standing guard while others fed, and when threatened, they split up, making it harder for the soldiers to track them. Farmers claimed that the emus were learning from each encounter, adapting to the soldiers' tactics. Whether true or not, the perception spread that these birds were no ordinary foes. Major Meredith himself commented that if the emus had been equipped with the ability to carry rifles, they might have been unbeatable. It was meant as a joke, but it underscored the absurdity of the situation. By the time the campaign ended, thousands of rounds of ammunition had been fired, but only a fraction of the emus had been killed. Estimates suggest that perhaps a few hundred birds were taken down, while the majority escaped unscathed. Considering there were over 20,000 emus in the region, the effect was negligible. The farmers were still desperate, the crops were still under siege, and the soldiers returned home humiliated. The press had a field day. Newspapers reported on the Great Emu War with a mix of ridicule and disbelief. Cartoons mocked the Australian army for failing against birds, and the story quickly spread beyond the continent. Australia had won battles against some of the most powerful armies in history, but against emus, they had suffered defeat. In the aftermath, the government tried other solutions. Bounties were offered for emu kills, and over time, farmers found more practical ways of protecting their land. The Emu War faded into history, remembered less for its impact on agriculture and more for its sheer absurdity. Yet the story remains a perfect example of how human pride and the machinery of war can be rendered ridiculous when confronted with the unpredictable forces of nature. The Great Emu War also highlights a deeper truth about history: not every conflict is glorious, not every campaign is heroic. Sometimes, history is shaped by moments of folly, when human determination collides with reality in ways that are almost comedic. For the farmers of Western Australia, the emu invasion was no laughing matter, but for the rest of the world, it became a symbol of the strange and unpredictable side of human history. Today, nearly a century later, the Great Emu War continues to fascinate people precisely because it feels so unbelievable. It has been retold in books, documentaries, and even video games, always with a touch of humor, yet beneath the jokes lies a serious reminder: history is filled with stories that challenge our expectations, that blur the line between tragedy and comedy. In 1932, the Australian Army marched out to defend farmland from birds and returned in defeat, and the world has never forgotten the lesson. Sometimes, the strangest wars are the ones that reveal the most about us. In the heart of medieval Europe, in the summer of 1518, the bustling city of Strasbourg was about to witness one of the strangest and most unsettling events in recorded history. It began with a single woman stepping into the street and dancing, not for joy, not for celebration, but with a compulsion that seemed to come from deep within her. Day after day, she moved, her feet pounding the cobblestones, her body swaying and jerking in unnatural rhythm. Within a week, dozens joined her. Within a month, hundreds of people were dancing in the streets of Strasbourg, unable to stop, even as exhaustion claimed their strength and lives. This was no festival. This was the infamous dancing plague of 1518, an event so bizarre that it defies belief even today. The first dancer, whose name survives in historical records as Frau Trophia, began her strange movements in July of that year. She danced alone for hours, then for days, seemingly unable to control herself. Her husband, neighbors, and local priests watched with confusion and growing fear. In a deeply religious society, unexplained behavior was often interpreted through the lens of sin, divine punishment, or demonic influence. Yet as more people joined her, the spectacle could not be dismissed as the madness of one woman. This was spreading, and spreading fast. Contemporary chronicles describe the scene with chilling detail. Men and women, young and old, took to the streets, writhing and leaping as if in a trance. Some collapsed from sheer exhaustion, only to rise again and continue their frenzied movements. Eyewitnesses claimed that dancers foamed at the mouth, their eyes glazed over, their faces twisted with agony. They could not stop. As the days wore on, some collapsed dead from heart attacks, strokes, or dehydration, their bodies giving out long before their minds seemed ready. The streets of Strasbourg became a macabre theater of life and death, the sound of drums and the sight of uncontrollable motion filling the air. The city council was alarmed. Strasbourg was not just any town, it was a thriving urban center within the Holy Roman Empire, a place of commerce and power. Yet here, in broad daylight, hundreds of its citizens were behaving as though possessed. The authorities called in physicians, who declared that this was not a case of witchcraft or demonic possession but a natural disease caused by overheated blood. In their medical worldview, the cure was not to restrain the dancers but to allow them to dance the sickness out of their bodies. Following this advice, the council made a decision that today seems almost surreal. They hired musicians and cleared halls for the dancers to continue. Drums, fiddles, and horns echoed through Strasbourg as the afflicted were encouraged to keep moving, their wild convulsions accompanied by organized music. The belief was that once the poison in their blood was released through sweat and motion, the dancing would stop. But the opposite happened. Instead of curing the dancers, the music seemed to intensify the mania. More people joined in. The epidemic spread like fire, pulling in hundreds. The streets were packed with writhing bodies, the sound of shoes striking stone day and night, an unending frenzy. The heat of summer only worsened the suffering. Witnesses recorded that some dancers screamed in pain, begged for mercy, or cried out to saints as their limbs flailed against their will. And still, they could not stop. What could have caused such a bizarre outbreak? Historians have debated this question for centuries. One theory points to ergot poisoning, caused by consuming moldy rye bread contaminated with a fungus that produces hallucinogenic compounds similar to LSD. Such poisoning could induce spasms, convulsions, and visions. Yet critics of this theory argue that ergot usually causes paralysis and gangrene, not days of rhythmic movement. Another explanation is mass hysteria, or what scholars call mass psychogenic illness. In times of extreme stress, fear, or hardship, groups of people can manifest physical symptoms together, driven by the power of collective belief. Strasbourg in 1518 was ripe for such a phenomenon. The city had recently endured famine, disease, and crushing poverty. Religious fervor was at a peak, with sermons warning of God's wrath and punishment for human sin. Under such psychological pressure, the outbreak may have been a kind of communal release, a desperate and unconscious act born from misery and fear. Religious interpretations at the time certainly framed the plague as divine punishment. Many believed that Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr associated with dancing and seizures, had cursed the people of Strasbourg. Pilgrimages were organized, and sufferers were led to shrines dedicated to the saint in hopes of deliverance. Some wore red shoes as part of rituals meant to ward off the curse. Yet despite these efforts, the dancing continued for weeks. Only by late August did the frenzy begin to fade, after nearly 2 months of chaos. The afflicted slowly recovered, the streets emptied, and life in Strasbourg resumed its fragile normality. But the scars of that summer lingered, etched into collective memory as a warning of forces beyond human understanding. The dancing plague was not an isolated incident. Similar outbreaks had occurred across medieval Europe, in Germany, Switzerland, and the Low Countries, though never on such a scale as Strasbourg in 1518. These events suggest that the phenomenon was part of a wider pattern of social stress and religious psychology, rather than a single isolated madness. Yet none of the other cases left as rich a record as Strasbourg, which remains the most dramatic and haunting example. What makes the dancing plague so compelling is the way it blurs the boundaries between science, superstition, and human psychology. Was this the effect of poisoned bread, the consequence of mass trauma, or something else entirely, something we still cannot explain with certainty? The very lack of clarity has allowed the event to remain in popular imagination, retold in countless books, plays, and even modern pop culture references. It is a reminder that history is not only about battles, kings, and empires but also about the strange and inexplicable experiences of ordinary people. Looking back now, the dancing plague of 1518 feels like a cautionary tale. It shows how fragile human societies can be under stress, how quickly the line between order and chaos can dissolve, and how deeply our minds and bodies are shaped by the times we live in. For the citizens of Strasbourg, the summer of endless dancing was no joke, it was terror, confusion, and death. For us, centuries later, it is a story that fascinates precisely because it defies our expectations. We want history to be logical, but here was an event that was anything but. Hundreds of men and women danced themselves to death in the streets of a medieval city, and no one, not the doctors, not the priests, not the officials, could explain or stop it. The dancing plague remains one of history's most bizarre mysteries, a haunting spectacle where joy and horror collided, and where the boundaries of the possible were shattered on the cobblestones of Strasbourg. In the long and tangled history of the papacy, there are countless tales of intrigue, corruption, and struggle for power. But none are quite as grotesque, or as surreal, as the infamous Cadaver Synod of 897 AD. In this bizarre trial, the corpse of a pope was dug up, dressed in papal robes, placed upon a throne, and forced to stand trial before a gathering of bishops and officials in Rome. It is an episode so macabre that it reads like dark satire, yet it was all too real. The Cadaver Synod remains one of the most disturbing spectacles ever staged in the name of religion and politics, a moment where power games descended into theater of the absurd. To understand how such a grotesque trial came about, we need to step back into the violent world of 9th-century Rome. The papacy at the time was not the powerful, centralized institution it would later become. Instead, it was entangled in the brutal politics of Italian noble families and the rivalries of the Holy Roman Empire. Popes were often pawns or players in a dangerous chessboard of alliances, betrayals, and assassinations. One pope in particular, Formosus, became the center of a storm that continued even after his death. Formosus had been pope from 891 until his death in 896. His reign was troubled by disputes over who should hold power in Italy. At the heart of the conflict was the question of imperial authority: should the papacy support the Carolingian dynasty, represented by Arnulf of Carinthia, or the local Roman aristocracy allied with the powerful Spoleto family? Formosus threw his support behind Arnulf, inviting him into Italy and even crowning him Holy Roman Emperor. This decision angered the Spoletans, who saw it as a direct threat to their influence. When Formosus died in 896, his enemies seized the opportunity to take revenge, not just against his memory, but against his very body. Enter Pope Stephen VI, a man with close ties to the Spoleto family. In January 897, he convened what would later be called the Cadaver Synod, a trial unlike any other. The corpse of Formosus, already decaying after months in the ground, was exhumed and dressed in full papal regalia. His lifeless body was propped up on a throne inside the Lateran Basilica, the traditional papal residence. Bishops gathered to act as judges, and Stephen himself presided as chief accuser. To complete the grotesque parody, a deacon was appointed to speak on behalf of the corpse, answering questions posed to the dead pope. The charges were numerous: perjury, violation of church law, and illegitimately ascending to the papacy. Chief among the accusations was that Formosus had unlawfully served as Bishop of Porto before becoming pope, something canon law at the time prohibited. But beneath the legalistic veneer, this was not about doctrine. It was about humiliating an enemy and rewriting history to favor the living pope's patrons. The spectacle was meant to send a clear message: the Spoletans and their allies controlled Rome, even to the point of judging the dead. Contemporary accounts describe the scene with horror. The corpse, dressed in magnificent robes but reeking of decay, sat stiffly on its throne as Pope Stephen shouted accusations at it. The deacon, trembling with fear, muttered responses in the cadaver's name, a surreal attempt to simulate dialogue between the living and the dead. Witnesses would later recall the trial as nightmarish, an unholy blending of theater and desecration. When the verdict was finally delivered, Formosus was declared guilty on all counts. His papacy was retroactively annulled, his ordinations invalidated, and his body stripped of sacred vestments. In a final act of degradation, the corpse was mutilated. 3 fingers of his right hand, the ones used for blessings, were severed. The body was then dragged through the streets of Rome and tossed into the Tiber River, as if to erase him from both memory and consecrated ground. But Rome was not so easily purged of its ghosts. The grotesque trial shocked and horrified many citizens. Even in an age accustomed to brutality, the sight of a pope desecrating his predecessor's corpse went too far. Riots broke out, and within months, the tide turned against Pope Stephen VI. His enemies overthrew him, imprisoned him, and ultimately strangled him to death in his cell. Power shifted once again, and the papacy was plunged into further chaos. In a strange twist, Formosus's body was later retrieved from the river and reburied with honor, while the acts of the Cadaver Synod were annulled by future popes. Yet the damage to Rome's reputation lingered. The very institution meant to embody spiritual authority had revealed itself capable of grotesque cruelty and political theater. The Cadaver Synod is often remembered today as a symbol of medieval excess, an episode where religion and politics became indistinguishable, and where hatred overcame even the boundaries of life and death. It is easy to laugh at the absurdity of putting a corpse on trial, but beneath the dark humor lies a deeper commentary on the nature of power. In 9th-century Rome, the struggle for control was so intense that even the grave offered no protection. Enemies were not only defeated but degraded, their memory rewritten, their very bodies turned into tools of vengeance. Historians have long debated the motives behind the Cadaver Synod. Was Pope Stephen simply a puppet of the Spoleto family, acting out their revenge? Was he mentally unstable, driven to excess by paranoia and rage? Or was this part of a calculated strategy to erase Formosus's legacy and strengthen his own claim to legitimacy? Whatever the answer, the spectacle backfired. Instead of securing stability, it fueled outrage and further weakened the papacy, ushering in a period that some later writers would call the pornocracy, an era of corruption and scandal dominated by powerful Roman families. For us today, the Cadaver Synod stands as one of history's most bizarre and unsettling moments, a reminder that institutions we consider sacred can be twisted into grotesque displays of human ambition. It strips away the aura of solemnity we often associate with medieval religion and reveals the papacy of the time as deeply entangled in the raw, ugly struggle for political survival. When we look back, we see not just a dead pope on trial, but a mirror reflecting the extremes of human pride, vengeance, and folly. More than 1,000 years later, the story of the Cadaver Synod continues to haunt the imagination. It is retold not because of its theological implications but because of its sheer strangeness, its almost theatrical absurdity. A dead pope, dressed in holy garments, accused and condemned by the living, if it were a scene in a play, it would be dismissed as too grotesque to believe. Yet it happened. And that is what makes it unforgettable. In the Cadaver Synod, history reached a moment where the line between tragedy and farce disappeared, leaving behind a spectacle as haunting as it is bizarre. In the history of Europe, few cities have such a peculiar political tradition as Prague, the capital of Bohemia. While most conflicts are settled with words, treaties, or swords, the people of Prague became notorious for solving disputes in a more dramatic fashion, by throwing their enemies out of windows. These infamous events, known collectively as the defenestrations of Prague, took place several times between the 15th and 17th centuries. What sounds almost comical, a man hurled from a window, became, in these cases, the spark for some of Europe's most destructive wars. Behind the absurdity lies a reminder of how small acts, rooted in anger and symbolism, can ignite decades of bloodshed. The first major defenestration occurred in 1419, a time of deep religious and political turmoil. Europe was still reeling from the Black Death and the Great Schism, when rival popes claimed authority over the Catholic Church. In Bohemia, tensions were especially fierce. A growing reformist movement, inspired by the teachings of the Czech priest Jan Hus, demanded changes to the church, simpler worship, communion in both bread and wine for lay people, and a rejection of clerical corruption. But the church hierarchy, supported by the king and nobility, resisted these demands. When Hus was burned at the stake for heresy in 1415, his followers, the Hussites, erupted in fury. By 1419, Prague was a city divided between Hussite reformers and Catholic loyalists. On July 30th of that year, a radical Hussite priest named Jan Zalivsky led a procession of his followers through the city, demanding the release of several prisoners. The crowd marched to the new town hall, where the Catholic city council refused to give in. Tempers flared. Stones were thrown. And then came the moment that would echo through history, the Hussites stormed the building, seized several council members, and hurled them out of the windows. The officials fell to their deaths on the cobblestones below. It was not just an act of violence, it was a symbolic rejection of authority, a literal expulsion of corrupt rulers from power. This dramatic act sparked the Hussite Wars, a brutal series of conflicts that engulfed Bohemia for years, pitting reformers against Catholic crusaders and leaving the land scarred by bloodshed. But Prague's strange method of political expression did not end there. Nearly 2 centuries later, in 1618, another defenestration would plunge Europe into chaos on a far greater scale. Once again, the issue was religion. The Protestant Reformation had swept across Europe, challenging Catholic dominance. In Bohemia, many nobles and citizens embraced Protestantism, while the ruling Habsburg dynasty remained staunchly Catholic. Tensions reached breaking point when Emperor Ferdinand II attempted to roll back religious freedoms previously granted to Protestants. In May 1618, a group of Protestant nobles stormed Prague Castle to confront the imperial governors enforcing the emperor's decrees. Heated words turned into fury. In a moment that seemed to draw directly from the memory of 1419, the nobles seized 2 Catholic officials and their secretary, dragged them to a high window of the castle, and hurled them out. Unlike their predecessors, however, these victims did not die. They fell nearly 70 feet, but survived, thanks, according to Catholics, to the miraculous intervention of angels, and according to Protestants, to the far less divine cushioning of a dung heap below. The survival did nothing to calm the storm. This act of defiance became the spark that ignited the 30 Years' War, one of the most devastating conflicts in European history. What began with a quarrel in a Bohemian castle window escalated into a continent-wide struggle that drew in nearly every major power, from Spain and France to Sweden and the Holy Roman Empire. The war lasted from 1618 to 1648, killing millions and leaving much of Central Europe in ruins. And it all began with men thrown from a window in Prague. These were not the only defenestrations in the city's history. Smaller incidents, less famous but equally telling, occurred in the years between. The act of throwing enemies from windows became a kind of political language in Bohemia, a statement that words and compromise had failed, that authority itself was being cast out. It was both literal and symbolic, a violent punctuation mark in the history of a city that seemed prone to eruption. The defenestrations of Prague remind us of how quickly the ridiculous can become tragic. On the surface, the image is almost comical, angry men tossing their rivals out of a window, as though in a farce. But the consequences were anything but humorous. The first defenestration led to decades of war between Hussites and Catholics, reshaping Bohemia and leaving a lasting mark on European religious politics. The second unleashed the 30 Years' War, which devastated entire regions, decimated populations, and shifted the balance of power across the continent. The absurd act of throwing someone from a window became the trigger for some of the bloodiest conflicts in European history. Historians often point to the symbolic power of these events. A window is not just an architectural feature, it is a threshold between inside and outside, power and exclusion, safety and danger. To be cast out of a window in Prague was more than execution, it was exile, rejection, humiliation. It carried a message to both the victims and the wider world: you no longer belong, and your authority is broken. The act's theatricality ensured it would be remembered, retold, and imitated, embedding itself in the political culture of Bohemia. Even today, the defenestrations of Prague remain a curious legacy in Czech history. They are recounted not only in textbooks but also in popular memory, a symbol of the city's turbulent past. For modern readers and viewers, the events stand out because they combine the absurd with the catastrophic. They remind us that history does not always unfold in predictable or dignified ways. Sometimes, the fate of nations is decided not in royal courts or great battles but in sudden, strange moments where anger explodes into action. The defenestrations are also a warning about the fragility of order. Beneath the veneer of civility, tensions can erupt with shocking speed. A quarrel becomes a riot, a shove becomes a defenestration, and in an instant, history veers off its expected course. From the cobblestones of Prague to the battlefields of Europe, the chain reaction is unmistakable. Small acts, especially when laden with symbolism, can unleash forces far beyond what their instigators intended. Looking back, the defenestrations of Prague stand as some of the most bizarre and consequential acts in European history. They began as sudden bursts of violence in a city torn by division, but their echoes spread across the continent. The sight of men tumbling from high windows became a metaphor for the collapse of order, a prelude to wars that would scar generations. It is a reminder that history is often stranger, darker, and more unpredictable than we expect. From a window in Prague, Europe tumbled into chaos. When we think of Napoleon Bonaparte, we imagine the great general astride a horse, armies at his command, reshaping Europe with his ambition and brilliance. He was a man who brought kings to their knees and redrew maps with campaigns that still astonish military historians. Yet among the long list of battles that mark his career, Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, there exists one encounter so peculiar, so utterly absurd, that it stands out as a bizarre footnote in his otherwise towering legacy. It was not against Austrians, Russians, or Prussians, but against a horde of rabbits. Yes, rabbits. In 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte, the master strategist of Europe, was chased off a field by an army of charging bunnies. The story begins in the aftermath of one of Napoleon's triumphs. By 1807, his forces had secured a series of victories across the continent. Following the Treaty of Tilsit, which marked peace with Russia and Prussia, the emperor decided to celebrate with his officers. And what better way to relax than with a hunting party? Hunting was a long-standing aristocratic tradition, a pastime that allowed rulers to demonstrate both their leisure and their dominion over nature. Napoleon, though a soldier rather than a born noble, embraced the trappings of leadership with gusto. He instructed his chief of staff, Alexander Berthier, to organize a grand rabbit hunt for himself and his inner circle. Berthier, meticulous as always, made the necessary arrangements. But instead of sourcing wild hares, which are difficult to catch and unpredictable in number, he chose the easier route. He purchased several thousand domesticated rabbits from local farmers. These tame creatures, raised in hutches, were far from the wily quarry of traditional hunts. They were used to human hands and, most importantly, used to being fed by them. When Berthier's men released the animals onto the hunting grounds, the stage seemed set for a grand, if somewhat artificial, day of sport. At first, the officers and courtiers waited eagerly for the hunt to begin. The expectation was simple: Napoleon and his men would scatter across the fields, muskets ready, chasing rabbits that darted for cover. But what happened next left everyone stunned. Instead of fleeing in terror at the sight of humans, the rabbits turned toward the hunters. They did not scatter, they swarmed. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of rabbits bounded forward, ears twitching, noses sniffing, racing not away but directly at Napoleon and his entourage. The emperor, who had faced down enemy cavalry charges, suddenly found himself on the receiving end of a very different kind of assault. The scene quickly devolved into chaos. The rabbits, far from acting like wild prey, assumed that the humans before them were their keepers. To them, Napoleon and his generals were not hunters but walking meals. They surged toward the party in waves, hopping over boots, tugging at coats, and nipping at hands in search of food. Muskets were useless against such numbers. To fire would be not only ridiculous but also dangerous in such close quarters. Officers tried to shoo them away with their hats, but the tide kept coming. Napoleon, famously composed in battle, could not hold back his shock and frustration. Accounts describe him laughing at first, then realizing that the swarm was not stopping. The rabbits pressed on, climbing into carriages, scurrying across the field, surrounding the emperor himself. His horse reared, startled by the relentless onslaught of fluffy attackers. Finally, Napoleon ordered a retreat. His party scrambled back toward their carriages, fleeing as the rabbits pursued them all the way. Imagine it, the conqueror of Europe, a man who had defeated some of the finest armies of his age, driven from the field not by bayonets or cannon fire but by hungry, domesticated rabbits who thought him their provider. It was absurd, embarrassing, and unforgettable. News of the incident spread quickly, carried in whispers and anecdotes among officers and diplomats. To Napoleon's enemies, it was a source of mockery, the emperor who could not defeat rabbits. Though it was never officially recorded in military histories, the story survived in memoirs and second-hand accounts, a bizarre footnote that clung stubbornly to his legend. Even centuries later, historians still recount it with equal parts disbelief and delight. In an age when monarchs and emperors sought to project strength and grandeur, there was something delightfully human in seeing the mighty Napoleon undone by such unlikely foes. But the rabbit incident also offers a glimpse into the culture of the Napoleonic era. Hunting was not merely recreation, it was a performance of power. By orchestrating grand hunts, leaders demonstrated control over nature itself. Napoleon, who had risen from obscurity to become emperor, was particularly eager to display his legitimacy in the eyes of Europe's aristocratic elite. Yet the irony of this episode is that, in trying to stage-manage a display of mastery, he revealed the fragility of image. A few thousand fluffy animals overturned the performance, reducing it to slapstick farce. The scene reminds us that power is always vulnerable to the unpredictable, and that history is not only made in grand chambers and bloody battlefields but also in moments of absurdity. From another angle, the event also reveals the gulf between the lives of common people and the preoccupations of rulers. In 1807, while peasants across Europe struggled with war, taxation, and hunger, their emperor was playing at hunting with caged rabbits. The story is a microcosm of the contradictions of empire, the grandeur of power alongside its trivial indulgences, the seriousness of war next to the silliness of spectacle. That such a moment could lodge itself in Napoleon's legend tells us how hungry people are for stories that puncture the myths of greatness. Today, the rabbit hunt of 1807 is remembered less as a failure and more as a reminder of the strange, often comic texture of history. Napoleon remains one of the most studied figures of his age, admired for his genius and reviled for his ambition. But even he, at the height of his power, could not escape becoming the butt of a joke. History often reveres its giants, but it also delights in showing their humanity, their flaws, their missteps, and their embarrassments. For all his victories, Napoleon could not conquer the simple expectations of hungry rabbits. In the end, the so-called Battle of the Bunnies stands as one of the strangest episodes in military folklore. It was not a clash of armies but a collision of worlds, the world of human ceremony and image against the stubborn instincts of animals who cared nothing for imperial dignity. And in that clash, for once, Napoleon was not the victor. On a cold January afternoon in 1919, the people of Boston's North End went about their routines with no inkling that they were about to witness one of the strangest disasters in American history. Life in the neighborhood was noisy and bustling, children played in the streets, horses pulled carts over the cobblestones, and dockworkers unloaded ships by the waterfront. It was an immigrant community, full of Italians, Irish, and others who had come seeking work and opportunity. Looming over them all, however, was a giant structure few gave much thought to, a steel storage tank holding more than 2 million gallons of molasses. Molasses, thick and sticky, was an everyday part of life back then, not just for baking sweets but as the key ingredient in producing rum and industrial alcohol. During World War I, alcohol distilled from molasses had been used for munitions, and the company that owned the tank, the Purity Distilling Company, had rushed to build it in 1915. Standing 50 feet high and 90 feet wide, the tank dominated the waterfront, a looming cylinder of dark steel. Residents complained for years that it leaked, sticky syrup oozing down its sides in the summer heat. But the company brushed off concerns, painting the tank brown to hide the stains and insisting it was safe. On January 15, 1919, Boston was unusually warm for winter. Temperatures had climbed into the 40s after a cold snap, and inside the tank the molasses was fermenting, producing gases that built up pressure. At about 12:30 in the afternoon, without warning, the tank gave way. With a deafening roar, rivets shot out like bullets. Then came the sound witnesses would never forget, a deep, rumbling boom, like the crash of thunder or cannon fire, followed by the rush of a flood unlike any other. A tidal wave of molasses, 25 feet high at its crest, burst forth, sweeping through the north end at 35 miles per hour. It sounded almost comical in description, but for those in its path it was a nightmare. Molasses is 8 times denser than water, and the wave carried with it the force of destruction. Wooden buildings splintered like matchsticks. Freight cars were flipped from the tracks. Horses were swallowed whole, drowned before they could break free. People caught in the flood found themselves trapped, their limbs weighed down by the sticky syrup. Some were suffocated where they stood, unable to breathe as the molasses filled their mouths and lungs. Eyewitnesses described scenes of horror and disbelief. A truck was hurled into the air like a toy. Children who had been playing near the tank vanished beneath the brown wave. Men and women screamed for help, but the more they struggled, the more the molasses clung to them, dragging them down. One firefighter, attempting to rescue survivors, was himself trapped when the floodwaters pinned him against a building. Only hours of digging saved his life. Within minutes, the neighborhood was a war zone, wreckage and sticky debris piled high. The rescue efforts were frantic and grueling. Police, Red Cross workers, and sailors from a nearby naval ship rushed to the scene. They waded through waist-deep syrup, their boots sucked into the muck. The molasses clung to clothing and skin, making every step exhausting. For survivors pinned in the wreckage, the sticky substance made extraction nearly impossible. Rescue dogs sent to sniff out bodies became mired and had to be pulled free. By nightfall, fires burned across the disaster zone as lanterns illuminated the surreal scene, horses lying stiff in pools of syrup, homes reduced to rubble, rescuers coated head to toe in molasses as they searched for survivors. In the end, 21 people were killed and around 150 were injured. Some died instantly, crushed by debris or drowned. Others lingered for days, their injuries complicated by the syrup that had invaded wounds and lungs. The tragedy shocked Boston and quickly became national news. Newspapers dubbed it the Boston Molasses Disaster, though many found it hard to believe that something so seemingly harmless could cause such devastation. In the days that followed, the cleanup proved nearly as challenging as the disaster itself. Crews shoveled hardened molasses, hacked it away with axes, and used saltwater and sand to wash the streets. For weeks, Boston Harbor turned brown from the runoff. Residents complained that the smell lingered for years, seeping into buildings, furniture, and even clothing. Horses, wagons, and boots tracked sticky residue across the city, spreading it far beyond the north end. Even decades later, locals swore that on hot summer days, you could still smell the faint sweetness of molasses in the air. But beneath the stickiness lay serious questions. Why had the tank collapsed? Why had warnings been ignored? In the months after the disaster, investigations revealed a grim truth. The tank had been poorly constructed from the start. It was rushed into service before it was even properly tested. Workers reported hearing strange groans from the steel walls long before the collapse, but their concerns were dismissed. The Purity Distilling Company had placed profit ahead of safety, and the people of Boston paid the price. In what became one of the earliest and most significant corporate liability cases in U.S. history, survivors and families of victims filed lawsuits against the company. The trial lasted years, with testimony from engineers, residents, and experts. Ultimately, the courts found United States Industrial Alcohol, the parent company of Purity Distilling, liable. They were forced to pay out around $628,000 in damages, a huge sum at the time, roughly equivalent to tens of millions today. The case set a precedent for holding corporations accountable for negligence, a legacy that extended far beyond the streets of Boston. The Great Molasses Flood remains a peculiar story, both tragic and surreal. To modern ears, it sounds almost like a joke, a flood of syrup rampaging through a city. But for those who lived through it, it was no laughing matter. It was a disaster that revealed the fragility of human constructs, the dangers of greed and haste, and the sheer unpredictability of life. It transformed an everyday substance, something sweet, sticky, and benign, into a weapon of destruction. Even today, more than a century later, the story of the molasses flood lingers as both legend and cautionary tale. Visitors to Boston can still hear it told as part of local lore, a reminder that history is not always grand battles or political revolutions. Sometimes it is the bizarre, the unexpected, the moments that defy belief yet leave deep scars. And in 1919, for the people of Boston, history came not in the form of armies or disasters of fire and water, but in a slow, sticky tide of molasses that swept away lives, homes, and a sense of security. In the summer of 1518, the people of Strasbourg, then a bustling city within the Holy Roman Empire, were gripped by a phenomenon so bizarre, so inexplicable, that it has echoed through history as one of the strangest medical mysteries ever recorded. It began quietly, almost innocently, with one woman stepping into the street and moving her body to an unheard rhythm. Within weeks, it would grow into a spectacle of mass hysteria, with hundreds of men, women, and even children dancing uncontrollably until they collapsed from exhaustion, injury, or even death. This was not a festival, not a celebration, but a nightmare, the infamous dancing plague of 1518. It began in July, when a woman named Frau Trophia stepped into a narrow street and began to dance. Witnesses later described her movements as frantic and unnatural, as if she could not stop herself. Hours passed, and still she danced, her body convulsing in a strange mixture of rhythm and compulsion. Neighbors gathered, first with curiosity, then with alarm. By the next day, she was still moving, and soon others joined her, whether out of sympathy, contagion, or some unseen force, no one could say. Within a week, dozens of people were caught up in the strange mania. Strasbourg's authorities watched with growing horror as the phenomenon spread. The dancers were not laughing or smiling, this was no joyous revel. They grimaced in pain, their feet bleeding, their bodies trembling with fatigue. Yet they could not stop. Accounts tell of people collapsing in the streets, only to rise again and resume their jerking, desperate motions. Physicians of the time, influenced by humoral theory, declared that the cause was hot blood that needed to be released through continuous movement. The remedy, they believed, was not to restrain the dancers but to encourage them, let them dance the illness out of their systems. So the city did something extraordinary, it built stages and cleared spaces for the afflicted to dance. Musicians were hired to provide rhythm, and professional dancers were brought in to lead them. The authorities, convinced they were offering a cure, inadvertently fanned the flames of the mania. With music swelling and space provided, the dancing plague exploded. By August, more than 400 people were caught in the frenzy. Day and night, the streets echoed with the sound of stamping feet and anguished cries. The toll was devastating. Many dancers collapsed from sheer exhaustion, their bodies unable to withstand the constant movement. Others suffered strokes or heart attacks brought on by the physical strain. Chroniclers claim that dozens perished, though the exact number remains uncertain. What is clear is that the city of Strasbourg was overwhelmed by a force it neither understood nor could control. Families wept as their loved ones danced themselves into ruin, priests prayed over the afflicted, and physicians debated cures as bodies piled up. What caused the dancing plague? Even now, centuries later, historians and scientists debate the answer. One theory is that the dancers were victims of ergot poisoning, a condition caused by eating bread made from rye infected with a toxic fungus. Ergot contains chemicals similar to LSD, which can produce hallucinations, spasms, and convulsions. Could it be that Strasbourg's bread supply had been contaminated, unleashing a hallucinatory frenzy? It is possible, but ergot poisoning typically causes sufferers to collapse in pain rather than dance for days on end, so the explanation is not perfect. Another theory is mass psychogenic illness, a kind of shared hysteria fueled by fear, stress, and suggestion. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city under pressure. The people were enduring famine, disease, and political instability. Religious fervor and apocalyptic fear gripped Europe, with many convinced that divine punishment loomed just around the corner. In such an atmosphere, the sight of one woman dancing uncontrollably may have triggered a collective psychosomatic response, with others falling into the same state. The body, influenced by the mind, carried them into motions they could not control. There is also the spiritual interpretation, one taken seriously at the time. Many believed the dancers were cursed by Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dance and epilepsy. Pilgrimages were organized to shrines dedicated to him, where sufferers sought relief. Some even wore red shoes as offerings, hoping the saint would free them from their torment. To the people of Strasbourg, the plague was not just a medical mystery but a spiritual crisis, a sign that the boundaries between the divine, the demonic, and the human had blurred. Regardless of the cause, the event eventually burned itself out. By late summer, the number of dancers dwindled, the stages were dismantled, and life in Strasbourg slowly returned to its uneasy normal. But the memory lingered. Chroniclers recorded the incident in detail, ensuring that it would pass into legend. The dancing plague became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the fragility of human reason and the strange forces that can sweep through communities. Even today, the story captivates because it sits at the intersection of history, psychology, and mystery. It forces us to confront the power of belief and the vulnerability of the human body. How could so many people lose control in such a dramatic way? Was it poison, hysteria, or something beyond science? We may never know. But the image endures, hundreds of men and women, sweating, bleeding, their feet pounding cobblestones in ceaseless rhythm, driven by a force stronger than their will. The dancing plague of 1518 is often told with a hint of humor, as though the idea of people dancing to death is absurd. But beneath the strangeness lies tragedy. These were real people, suffering, unable to stop their own destruction. Their plight reveals how fragile the boundary is between order and chaos, health and madness. In the end, Strasbourg's dancing plague reminds us that history is filled not only with wars and kings but with moments when human life veered into the inexplicable, leaving behind mysteries that still unsettle us 500 years later. In the long and turbulent history of the papacy, there are countless tales of corruption, intrigue, and betrayal. Yet among all the scandals and power struggles, one event stands out as so macabre, so grotesque, that it seems more like the plot of a Gothic novel than a real episode in church history. In the year 897, in the city of Rome, a pope was put on trial. That, in itself, was not unusual. Popes had been accused, condemned, and even deposed before. But what made this trial unforgettable was the fact that the pope in question had been dead for months. His rotting corpse was exhumed, dressed in papal robes, and propped up on a throne to face judgment. This ghastly spectacle became known as the Cadaver Synod. To understand how such a bizarre event could take place, we must first look at the political chaos of Rome in the late 9th century. The papacy was not only a spiritual office but a seat of immense temporal power, controlling land, wealth, and influence that rivaled kings. Competing noble families in Rome and beyond vied to install their candidates as pope, often through bribery, intimidation, or outright violence. Loyalty to one faction often meant bitter enmity with another, and a pope's legacy could be rewritten depending on who seized power next. Pope Formosus, the central figure of the Cadaver Synod, was himself a controversial character. He had served as pope from 891 until his death in 896, and during his reign, he navigated alliances with powerful rulers like Arnulf of Carinthia and rivalries with the influential Spoleto family. His enemies accused him of political betrayal, of unlawfully seizing the papal throne, even of violating church law by serving as bishop in more than one diocese. When he died in April 896, he was buried with the dignity expected of a pope. But his death did not end the hatred of his enemies. His successor, Pope Stephen VI, sometimes called Stephen VII in older sources, came to power under the influence of the Spolitans, bitter rivals of Formosus. Eager to appease his patrons and erase the legacy of his predecessor, Stephen made an extraordinary decision: he would put Formosus on trial, not metaphorically, but literally. The corpse of the dead pope would be exhumed, and his sins would be judged before the clergy of Rome. And so, in January of 897, the trial began. The body of Formosus, months in the grave, was dragged from its tomb and clothed once more in the full regalia of the papacy, ornate robes, the pallium, even the papal tiara. It was placed on a throne in the Lateran Basilica, propped upright as if to preside over its own condemnation. Witnesses describe a horrifying sight: the decayed body, stiff and grotesque, dressed in finery, its lifeless hand raised in mock benediction. Before this ghastly figure, Pope Stephen VI and a council of bishops convened. Of course, the dead cannot speak, so a deacon was appointed to act as Formosus's advocate. In a surreal parody of justice, Stephen VI hurled accusations at the corpse, that Formosus had broken canon law, that he had illegitimately claimed the papal throne, that he had conspired against his rivals. The deacon responded on the cadaver's behalf, offering feeble defenses, but the outcome was never in doubt. The spectacle was theater, an act of vengeance disguised as justice. The assembled clergy, cowed by Stephen's authority, found Formosus guilty. The sentence was both symbolic and brutal. The corpse was stripped of its sacred vestments, the 3 fingers of its right hand, those used in blessing, were cut off. The body was declared unworthy of burial in holy ground. At first, it was interred in a common grave, but even this was deemed too merciful. Soon after, it was dug up once more and flung into the Tiber River, a final humiliation for the disgraced pope. For the people of Rome, the cadaver synod was both horrifying and shocking. Many were outraged at the desecration, not because they necessarily loved Formosus, but because the grotesque spectacle had desecrated the dignity of the papacy itself. To drag a corpse into court, to stage such a macabre parody of justice, this was more than politics, it was sacrilege. Whispers of unease spread through the city, and soon the outrage boiled over. Within months, a popular uprising broke out against Pope Stephen VI. The backlash was fierce. He was seized, imprisoned, and eventually strangled to death. His violent end was seen by many as divine retribution for the monstrous trial he had presided over. The corpse of Formosus, meanwhile, was retrieved from the river and restored to a place of honor in the church, as though Rome itself sought to erase the grotesque indignity. The cadaver synod did not put an end to the chaos of the papacy in the 9th and 10th centuries. Far from it, it was only one chapter in what historians call the Saeculum Obscurum, or Dark Age, of the papacy, when powerful Roman families treated the Holy See as a prize to be won and lost through intrigue. But the cadaver synod remains the most infamous episode of that era, remembered for its sheer grotesqueness. What are we to make of this strange moment in history? History is often remembered for its great battles, its wars between nations, kings, and empires. But sometimes, tucked between the chronicles of human conflict, we stumble across stories so strange, so absurd, that they defy all expectations. One such tale comes from Australia in the early 1930s, when the nation found itself locked in a bizarre conflict, not against another country, not against a rebellion, but against a bird. Not just any bird, but the emu, a tall, flightless creature with long legs, sharp claws, and a knack for survival. The episode became known, half in jest and half in shame, as the Great Emu War of 1932. To understand how such an unusual war could erupt, we must first step into the harsh realities of post-World War I Australia. The nation was struggling economically. Many soldiers who had returned from the Great War were given land in rural Western Australia, part of government schemes to settle veterans as farmers. They were expected to grow wheat and contribute to feeding the country. But the late 1920s and early 1930s brought disaster, falling wheat prices, the onset of the Great Depression, and worsening drought. farmers already found it nearly impossible to make a living. Then came the emus. Emus are the second largest birds in the world, native to Australia, and they are formidable survivors. Standing up to 2 meters tall, they are fast, strong, and highly adaptable. Every year, as part of their migration patterns, large flocks moved from inland Australia toward the coast. But in 1932, these migrations coincided with wheat harvests in Western Australia. Suddenly, some 20,000 emus descended on the farmers' fields, trampling crops, devouring wheat, and ruining fences. The birds also created openings in barriers that allowed rabbits, a second plague, to rush in and do further damage. For farmers already on the brink of ruin, this was a disaster. The farmers cried out for help, and their pleas reached the government. What followed was a decision that, in hindsight, feels almost comical. The government agreed to send military assistance. Not financial relief, not better fences, not hunting subsidies, no, instead, the Minister of Defense approved the use of soldiers armed with machine guns to combat the emu menace. In November 1932, Major G. P. W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery was dispatched to the front lines with 2 soldiers, a pair of Lewis guns, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. It was, in every sense, a military operation against birds. The campaign began in earnest in late November. On the 2nd, the troops attempted to ambush a group of emus near Campion. About 50 birds were spotted, and the soldiers opened fire. But the emus, surprisingly agile, scattered quickly. The machine guns killed only a few before the rest vanished into the scrub. The men soon learned a hard truth: emus were not easy targets. They moved quickly, often in small, coordinated groups, and their tall bodies absorbed bullets with unexpected resilience. As Major Meredith later remarked, the emus displayed a kind of military cunning, as if they had generals of their own coordinating their maneuvers. On another occasion, a large flock of over 1,000 birds was sighted. Excited, the soldiers positioned their guns and prepared for a decisive strike. But the gun jammed almost immediately after opening fire, and the birds dispersed before more than a handful were killed. The soldiers gave chase, but it was hopeless. Emus could run at speeds of nearly 50 kilometers per hour, outpacing the men easily. The landscape, rough and unforgiving, favored the birds, not the soldiers dragging heavy weaponry. For days, the military patrol roamed the countryside, trying to corner their elusive enemy. Reports from the field described the absurdity of the situation: uniformed soldiers, armed with machine guns, sprinting after giant birds that refused to fight back, only to vanish into the brush. The farmers, who had hoped for quick relief, looked on with growing frustration. By the second week of the campaign, it became clear that the war was not going well. Newspapers picked up the story, and headlines mocked the government's efforts. The emus, it seemed, were winning. In fact, some reports suggested the birds had even adapted to the attacks. They traveled in smaller groups, making them harder to target en masse. Bullets often struck without killing, as the birds' tough bodies and feathers absorbed the impact. Soldiers began joking that the emus were invincible, a feathered army immune to human weapons. Major Meredith himself, perhaps only half in jest, described them as having bulletproof feathers. By mid-December, after weeks of failed engagements, the government decided to call off the operation. Out of 10,000 rounds of ammunition, only a few hundred birds had been killed. The rest, tens of thousands, remained at large, continuing to devastate crops. The military quietly withdrew, leaving behind a sense of embarrassment that lingered long after. The aftermath of the so-called Emu War was not a total loss for the farmers. The government eventually introduced bounty systems, allowing locals to hunt emus themselves for payment. This proved far more effective, as it harnessed the efforts of many individuals rather than relying on clumsy military action. Fences were also improved, and the emu population was gradually brought under control. But the memory of the military's failure remained, a reminder of just how absurdly outmatched humans can be when nature decides to fight back. The Great Emu War quickly entered folklore. To this day, it is recounted with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Australians often tell the story as a kind of national joke, an episode where soldiers armed with modern weaponry were humbled by flightless birds. Yet beneath the humor lies a sobering truth: the war symbolized the deep struggles of rural Australia during the Depression. The farmers were desperate, abandoned by the market, and in their desperation, the government's clumsy solution turned into a farce. Still, the story endures because of its sheer absurdity. Where else in history do we find a war waged not against an empire or a rebellion, but against animals who simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? The emus, for their part, carried on with their lives, oblivious to the grand narratives of human politics. They did not surrender, they did not negotiate, they simply survived, as they always had. Today, the Great Emu War has become a symbol of humility, a reminder that no matter how powerful human technology may seem, nature often finds a way to outwit us. It is a piece of history that is both ridiculous and profound, teaching us that sometimes the greatest battles are not those won or lost on the field, but those that reveal the limits of our own control. And so, the emus of 1932 secured a peculiar victory, forever remembered as the unlikely champions of one of the strangest wars in history. At dawn on June 30, 1908, deep within the remote Siberian wilderness, an explosion tore through the sky with a force so unimaginable that it flattened over 80 million trees across more than 2,000 square kilometers of forest. Witnesses, hundreds of miles away, described a fireball streaking across the heavens, brighter than the sun. Windows shattered, shockwaves rippled through the air, and a thunderous roar echoed like the sound of cannons. For days afterward, the skies glowed with strange, ghostly light visible as far away as Europe. This was no war, no volcano, no human act of destruction. This was the mysterious Tunguska event, the largest impact event in recorded human history, and one of the greatest scientific puzzles of the modern age. The epicenter of the blast lay near the Podkamenia Tunguska River, a region so isolated that no roads, no railways, no towns existed nearby. Had the explosion occurred over a populated city, it would have left devastation on a scale comparable to a nuclear bomb. But because it struck a remote corner of Siberia, the human toll was limited, though still shocking. Local reports spoke of herders thrown from their reindeer, huts destroyed, and people scorched by the heat. One man, miles from the blast, was said to have been hurled into the air by the shockwave, losing consciousness only to awaken and find the forest around him on fire. Yet the most haunting part of the event was its sheer scale. Trees were leveled in a radial pattern, their trunks pointing outward like matchsticks from the epicenter. At ground zero, trees remained standing but stripped of branches and bark, scorched into lifeless poles. Wildlife perished in massive numbers, though much of this went undocumented because of the area's remoteness. To those who eventually saw it, the landscape resembled an otherworldly scar, a reminder that something extraordinary had happened, but with no clear evidence of what. The mystery deepened because no impact crater was ever found. Normally, such an explosion would suggest a meteorite strike, yet there was no massive rock buried beneath the soil. For years, the absence of a crater puzzled both scientists and locals, giving rise to speculation. Some villagers whispered that the gods had sent fire to punish mankind. Others told legends of an angry deity striking the land with divine arrows. And in the decades that followed, speculation spread far beyond folklore. Was this a meteor, a comet, or even something more mysterious, an alien craft that exploded in Earth's atmosphere? The first scientific expedition to the Tunguska site did not occur until 1927, nearly 20 years after the explosion. Led by Leonid Kulik, a Russian mineralogist, the team trekked through the harsh Siberian landscape to investigate. What they found confirmed the immense devastation. Tens of thousands of trees still lay flattened, forming a perfect butterfly pattern radiating from the blast center. Yet still, no crater, no large meteorite fragments, no smoking gun. Kulik's team did recover small pieces of silicate and metallic spheres embedded in the soil, suggesting extraterrestrial material, but nothing on the scale one would expect from an impact so massive. The leading scientific explanation eventually emerged. The Tunguska event was caused not by a meteorite striking the ground but by an object exploding in the atmosphere. This theory, called an airburst, suggests that a stony asteroid or comet, perhaps 50 to 60 meters across, entered Earth's atmosphere at tremendous speed. As it descended, the pressure and heat caused it to fragment and detonate at an altitude of about 5 to 10 kilometers above the surface. The result was an explosion estimated to be between 10 and 15 megatons, roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. If true, this would explain the lack of a crater. The object never reached the ground intact. Instead, the blast's shockwave devastated the forest beneath it. Yet even with this explanation, questions remain. Why has no definitive fragment been located? Why did witnesses describe such strange phenomena in the skies afterward, such as glowing nights visible thousands of miles away? Some scientists point to fine dust particles thrown into the upper atmosphere, scattering light. Others, less conventional, argue that something entirely unknown may have occurred. Over the years, countless alternative theories have been proposed. Some suggest the culprit was a comet, whose icy body would have vaporized completely, leaving little trace. Others argue for exotic explanations, natural gas eruptions, antimatter collisions, or even alien spacecraft self-destructing in the skies. While mainstream science leans toward the airburst theory, the enduring lack of physical evidence continues to invite speculation. Perhaps most chilling of all is the reminder Tunguska gives us: Earth is not immune to cosmic violence. Had the object arrived only a few hours later, the city of St. Petersburg might have been obliterated. Millions could have perished in a single instant, rewriting 20th century history before it had even begun. The Tunguska event was, in essence, a warning shot from the universe, a demonstration of the raw power of celestial objects that routinely cross Earth's orbit. Modern research has revisited the site with satellites, soil studies, and computer modeling. Some tiny glass-like beads, consistent with meteorite origin, have been found in the soil, strengthening the case for a cosmic explanation. Remote sensing has mapped the pattern of destruction in detail, confirming the airburst model. Yet the event remains a riddle wrapped in mystery, as definitive, irrefutable proof still eludes us. For the people who lived through it, however, science mattered less than survival. To them, the event was terrifying, inexplicable, and profoundly real. They spoke of the sky splitting apart, of unbearable heat, of a roaring sound that seemed to tear the world itself in two. To this day, indigenous Evenki elders pass down stories of the Great Fire from the heavens, a cultural scar etched alongside the physical one left in the forest. The Tunguska event continues to haunt us because it is both extraordinary and ordinary at once. Extraordinary because it stands as one of the most powerful natural events in recorded history, yet ordinary because it was not unique. Similar airbursts have struck Earth countless times, though usually over oceans or uninhabited regions. Tunguska is simply the one we witnessed, the one that left its mark upon us. In the end, the Tunguska event remains a chilling reminder of our fragility. Civilizations may rise and fall, wars may rage and empires collapse, but a single rock from space, no larger than a city block, has the power to erase it all in an instant. On that summer morning in 1908, humanity caught a glimpse of that power. And even now, over a century later, the silence of Siberia still carries the echo of the sky's great fire. History is often remembered as a grand narrative of empires rising and falling, of great leaders, epic battles, and sweeping revolutions. But when we look closer, when we peel back the polished veneer of official chronicles, we discover that history is not only shaped by kings and wars, it is also shaped by the strange, the inexplicable, and the downright bizarre. The stories we have explored, the London beer flood, the eruption of Mount Tambora, the dancing plague, the cadaver synod, the war against emus, and the fiery skies over Tunguska, remind us that the past is filled with moments that defy expectation. They are windows into a world where human beings, no matter how powerful or powerless, were often at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. Taken together, these events reveal something important about the human condition, our enduring attempt to make sense of chaos. When a pope's corpse was dragged into court centuries after his death, it wasn't just a grotesque display of politics, it was an attempt to impose order on a fractured church. When hundreds of people in Strasbourg danced themselves into exhaustion, it was not mere madness, but a symptom of a society under unbearable stress, grasping for meaning in the grip of fear. Even the so-called Great Emu War shows us the absurdity of human pride, as soldiers armed with machine guns were humbled by nature's resilience. Again and again, we see humanity struggling not just with survival, but with interpretation, trying to explain, to rationalize, to weave stories around the inexplicable. The strange and the dark corners of history often endure longer in memory than grand conquests or royal decrees. We laugh at the image of emus outrunning soldiers, but we also reflect on the desperation of Depression-era farmers. We marvel at the destructive force of Tunguska's explosion, but beneath the awe lies a sobering truth: had it struck hours later, an entire city might have vanished. These events cling to us because they are more than curiosities. They expose the fragility of our lives, the thin line that separates order from chaos, triumph from disaster. There is also something profoundly human in our fascination with the bizarre. In every culture, people tell stories of strange happenings, plagues of dancing, floods of beer, skies set ablaze. Such stories endure because they awaken our imagination. They remind us that history is not a neat, linear march forward, but a twisting, unpredictable path shaped by accident as much as by intention. Behind every bizarre event lies a community of people who lived through it, whose lives were forever altered, and whose stories ripple forward to us centuries later. Perhaps the most striking lesson is that the unexpected is always closer than we think. For the people of London in 1814, an ordinary afternoon turned into catastrophe as a wave of beer swept through their streets. For the villagers of Tunguska in 1908, a quiet morning became a moment of cosmic violence. For the farmers of Australia in 1932, the struggle for survival took a surreal turn against giant, flightless birds. These moments remind us that history is not just about what we plan, but about what surprises us. It is about resilience, adaptation, and sometimes, sheer survival in the face of absurdity. And yet, in the retelling, these events give us more than lessons, they give us perspective. They force us to confront the limits of our control, the hubris of our ambitions, and the mystery of the world we inhabit. For every carefully drawn battle map or royal genealogy, there is an equally compelling story of chaos and chance. History is not only about the powerful shaping the powerless, it is also about floods of beer, plagues of dance, and skies that rain fire. As we look back at these bizarre historical events, we are left with an unsettling but important realization: history is stranger than fiction. The things that truly happened, witnessed by ordinary people, are often more surreal than the most imaginative novel or film. And perhaps that is why we return to them, not only to laugh, or to marvel, but to remind ourselves that the past was lived by people as complex, vulnerable, and bewildered as ourselves. In the end, the bizarre episodes of history are not footnotes. They are reminders. Reminders that life has always been unpredictable, that humanity has always wrestled with forces beyond its grasp, and that in every era, people have stood at the edge of the unexplainable. Sometimes they fought back, sometimes they laughed, sometimes they suffered, but always, they endured. So when we hear of the beer flood, or the Emu War, or the cosmic fire over Siberia, we should not dismiss them as curiosities. Instead, we should see them for what they truly are: stories of survival, of absurdity, and of humanity's endless dance with the unknown. Because if history teaches us anything, it is that the bizarre is not the exception, it is part of the story. And perhaps, one day, our own strange moments, our accidents, our mysteries, our absurdities, will be told as well, echoing through time as proof that history has always been, and will always be, far stranger than we can imagine.